Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on episode 75 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. My name is Billy Bob. I'm on the West Coast. That's why I say morning. It's a little bit after 9 a.m. I've got Ben Toth in Paich, Hungary. It's 6 p.m. there. Max Parry from New York City. And it's noon, I believe, in New York. Carlo Parcelli from Washington, D.C. It's also noon there. This is the extent of our panel today. John Steppling might be stopping by later. But I did want to mention that Ian Cummer, I had a disagreement with him last episode, and so he's off the show. We have removed him from the panel. He will not be disagreeing with me anymore. Just kidding. He's on vacation in Crimea. So he will be back in a week or two. So that's why he's not there. So yeah, we did have a little bit of a disagreement on an interesting topic last episode. But not to worry. This was a scheduled departure on his part. He's on special assignment in Crimea. So having said that, we do have the excellent Max Parry. Max Parry did a phenomenal article recently published at Covert Action Mag.
In the comments.
Link is in the comments, discussing the creation of Israel and Soviet responsibility, culpability in that creation, and he describes the context in which the Soviet Union kind of went against their own principles to do this thing, and it turned out to be a mistake. So maybe we can learn not to go against our principles, but. What else? The other item we were going to maybe discuss was just Israel influence in, the Israel lobby over U.S. politics. But let's start with this video of State Department spokesman or is it White House spokesman?
No, State Department.
State Department spokesman Patel, refusing to answer some basic obvious questions. So they're just in this corner, and the poor guy just doesn't have his job's impossible. But you want to run that clip, Ben, and or I can. Okay,
sure, why not? I hope it has decent audio.
Do you reject the interference of a foreign leader calling for the crackdown on full American citizens exercising their basic rights, their First Amendment right to demonstrate? That's what I'm asking you.
The prime minister was commenting on something happening in this country. I will say,
I'm not
over the
asking
course
the prime
of this,
minister. I'm asking you. You are here representing the government of the United States of America. I'm asking you as an officer of this government, of this administration, do you reject the interference of a foreign leader saying that you must crack down on Americans exercising their right to demonstrate? It's a very simple question.
I wouldn't equate that to interference.
Don't you feel offended by the fact that a foreign leader is trying to fan the flames against Palestinian Americans in this country? That's exactly what he's doing. You don't feel offended by that?
Said, that is not how I would interpret the prime minister's comment.
By the way, kudos to Saeed, because he kept on. He was very dogged, trying to keep on to force him to please answer the question, what's the State Department position? But you can't give an answer, unfortunately. Yeah.
So imagine Putin, right? Imagine Putin suggesting, maybe the U.S. ought to do this or that, or Xi Jinping, saying, hey, maybe U.S. policy. I mean, they would be up in arms. It would be a tremendous. It would be a huge story, and it would not be tolerated. It would be denounced. So it kind of demonstrates a little bit of hypocrisy.
Yeah, I mean, when I remember when Trump torpedoed the Iran nuclear deal, or pulled the U.S. out of it unilaterally, Benjamin Netanyahu openly bragged that he was the one that convinced Trump to do so. And this was in the midst of the, Mueller investigation and Russiagate and all that. And of course, that was, never brought up as anything to be concerned about. That there was no, no disproportionate influence of Israel over Trump's policies, even though Netanyahu was openly bragging about it. Just in the same way he's been able to give closed door addresses to Congress, unlike any other world leader, and so on and so forth. I mean, Israel, it's unbelievable what they're able to get away with, unlike any other country. And of course, as soon as you get into that, it's
just a quick addition to that. When it comes to diplomatic protocol, I think Netanyahu was the only guy who went to meet U.S. representatives. I don't know if it was the Congress or these guys, but without Obama's approval, without just going there to influence them. I know there was a big row in diplomacy back at that time, but he can do these things. Yeah.
Well, it's nice, Ben, of you to give Max a pass. So I hear very clearly what Max is saying. Max hates Jews, and he's engaging in this trope that says the Israel, is the tail which is wagging the U.S. dog. So, just kidding, Max.
No, yeah, the Zionist occupied government. I mean, no, I mean it's interesting how there's actually been. I would like to call attention to some very important series of articles by Diana Johnstone, not to be confused with Caitlin Johnstone, of course. Diana Johnstone at Consortium News, because she's written a series of articles about this very topic. And, I mean, Diana Johnstone is one of my favorite political writers, had a huge impact on me, especially her book on Yugoslavia, and all the work she's done. But on this particular issue, I actually disagreed with her somewhat. There's two kind of camps that seem to take sides on this topic. There's the people that are citing John Mearsheimer's work on AIPAC and the Israel lobby, are very much and Diana Johnstone is one of them. Very much arguing that since the Project for the New American Century and the doctrine of preemption, Wolfowitz doctrine, and the increase in influence monetarily of the Israel lobby, that the tail is wagging the dog, and that Israel, in fact, dictates U.S. policy in the Middle East. And then you have the opposite camp, which is actually, I'm kind of bummed that John Steppling isn't here, because he's very much in the opposite camp, which are people that, are the sort of traditional leftist view that Israel is a U.S. proxy. It was created, obviously, as everyone knows, by the British, and the United States reaped what the British sowed in terms of after World War II, the United States became a global hegemon and inherited from the British Empire, which was obviously not the same after the end of World War II, but that Israel is very much a satellite for the United States, or an outpost for Western imperialism. And my position has always been somewhere in the middle, which is that it's really a symbiotic relationship. You have obviously these especially right now, these very extreme kahanists within the Israeli government that are increasingly more and more ultra-nationalist and far-right, and their interests don't always align with the United States. Obviously, they frequently do, but there are elements within Israel that are, a perfect example is during the beginning of the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein bombed Tel Aviv, and Israel wanted to respond, and the United States ended up using foreign aid, specifically the administration of George H.W. Bush, actually, of all people, used the foreign aid to Israel as leverage, because they wanted to preserve the anti-Iraq coalition of Arab states in the region. And I think that the interests, that's a perfect example of how the interests don't always align, and the United States and certain elements within Israel will frequently butt heads. And I don't think that it's purely one way or the other. I mean, I think that it's important to read the Diana Johnstone series of articles, because she's was critiquing specifically Michael Hudson and Ben Norton, who were in their, I believe it was Ben Norton's podcast, very much taking the traditional leftist line that Israel is merely a proxy for Western imperialism, and pushing back against the idea that, you know, the wars waged against Iraq and the regime change in Libya and the attempts in Syria was about, you know, knocking these pieces off the chessboard that support, you know, the Palestinian resistance and so on and so forth. But I think that there's a dichotomy that comes up around this issue that when I think the answer is really somewhere more in the middle. I really don't agree with, you know, we were joking about Zog and, you know, all that. But I think that neither position is really correct. And it's really more somewhere in the middle, because I mean, and right now is really a perfect example. I mean, look at the bind that the Biden administration is in, where
with the ICC.
Yeah, the public backlash, the upheaval within the Democratic Party has really put him in a difficult position. And clearly now what the U.S. or what Biden is doing to save face is to try and make this all about Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's going to become probably a campaign wedge issue, you know, in the same way that they tried to diplomatically isolate bin Salman, and then what he was promising in the last election that he was going to sanction him, and that there was going to be a reset of policy with Saudi Arabia. And then as soon as the election was over, that was completely abandoned, and
we had the fist bump.
Yeah. So I think that the same thing is going on here. However, I'm not sure that it's really going to work out. I mean, things are really looking grim for Biden. But I think in regard to this issue, people should take a look at the articles, the couple articles by Diana Johnstone, because
she's great. And yeah, I've really appreciated. I mean, I remember when the whole punch a Nazi, you know, division was going through the left a couple years ago, and she wrote a great
the Richard Spencer punch, right?
Yeah, that ticked it off, but it kind of divided the left a little bit. And then I really like Diana Johnstone's take on that.
Yeah, normally I agree with her, but on this particular article, I kind of
I'm gonna check it out for sure. I have a lot to say about that topic. Ben and Carlo, I don't want to monopolize.
I want to inquire more, because I really enjoyed this, because the two camps they look exclusive. It's this way, and the other one is the opposite view. And really, I think you're onto something. I'm just wondering how to square these two. How much the vector goes one way and the vector goes other way, because, you know, we've got the most recent, the ICC apparently is going to launch this week some arrest warrants for Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett. Anyway, but already Johnson and another senator has said there will be repercussions. We're going to sanction the ICC. Obviously, they're not a signatory to this, neither is Russia. But apparently these are not okay. Whereas I think Vladimir Putin still has an outstanding arrest warrant for saving children from a war zone. And that's just perfectly fine. It's just a latest example of complete double standards. But yeah, how does this work? What is
he should have killed 15,000 Ukrainian children, and then they'd be thinking about maybe issuing a warrant for him.
No, he maybe get a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah,
for saving them. Let's go back to the net. I don't want to. If this is not appropriate, let me know. Well, let's go back to the Netanyahu comment, where he wanted U.S. citizens, the kids on campus, to be arrested or worse. And then who steps in? But, you know, I lost it. I lost it just like Scott Ritter lost
Bernie.
When I saw the pigs on campus, it brought back so many memories. I lost it. Okay. So I was just twittering these things, very anti-police, just the police themselves.
and I lost a bunch of followers. I didn't have very many to lose, but I lost quite a few of them because that's the way that's the way Americans think. They think, I don't know what they thought I was putting up all along, but when I started to attack the cops, that's where it ended. They're on campus, okay? What do the campuses rely on? They rely on huge donations. Who makes huge donations to universities like Columbia? American Jews and Jews and Zionists
Businessmen,
from other
APAC, yeah.
countries to keep those campuses afloat. Not to mention the military industrial complex, which is all over them. So when when the campuses are in a bind because on the one hand they're supposed to be for free expression, but they're not. But I don't think there's a clear divide between the U.S. controlling Israel or Israel controlling the U.S. I think they're mutually in harmony. And I've said this before. I don't think it's once again I'll mention it's to me like Biden to save his election is playing good cop to Netanyahu's bad cop to a certain degree. But by the same token, he's absolutely happy to see these kids get their heads bashed in, to see professors thrown to the ground and somebody kneeling on their head.
He's taken more money from APAC than any other politician in American history, going all the way back to when his career started in the 70s.
Yeah, so it's a complex question. I just think that it's almost biological in structure. That is, the malignancies have woven into each other to such a degree to discern them
Max,
two separate entities is virtually impossible at this point.
I agree, but yeah, Max, that's what I wanted you to kind of get into, if you can. Protest to one side, but also, most of the interests of the U.S. empire and Israel, they're interwoven. They're perfectly compatible. Some of them are outliers, like there's an election, and I think Biden is the worst supported. Let me just quickly cheat. Yes, the least popular president in 70 years, below Nixon and Carter. That's something that's unacceptable to him. But I think the cleansing of Rafah and Gaza all is perfectly compatible with the plans of the US. Because remember the IMEC, the Israel, Middle East, Europe gas corridor that was supposed to be there. Netanyahu showed it at the UN. That was fully sponsored, absolutely fine with the US. But then there's which is why I think Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer also, they want Netanyahu gone, because now they can blame all this inconvenience on the one guy and basically continue. So there's very little that the two diverge on. There is, but it's not like a colony gone rogue. But why don't you expand on sort of that? What's in common, the threads that bind? Because I think you're onto something.
Well, I agree. I think you could argue that some of, like, for example, like the more extreme, followers of Mir Kahan that are now cropping up in the Israeli recent Netanyahu administrations, from Avigdor Lieberman to now the big one is Itamar Ben-Gvir.
Ben-Gvir, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the plans, for example, for like Greater Israel and sort of like the expansionist wing, I don't know if you could call them that, of far-right elements in the Israeli government. I don't know how much all of their plans or, their ideas about annexing more and more territory it's also important to note that there's different factions and wings within the Israel lobby itself. There's the J Street wing, and then there's the Chaim Saban, he's dead now, but Sheldon Adelson wing, and that's sort of more of the Trump camp, whereas the J Street wing of AIPAC.
Sorry, I'm European. I don't know what the J Street means. What's a J Street?
Well, J Street, it's sort of the liberal advocacy. It's pro-Israel, but they want to solve this is just what they ostensibly claim to support. They claim to support a more diplomatic, peaceful resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I think that they were, for example, their political action committees have, they've donated to a lot of progressive Democrats and progressive Democrats.
The J stands for Jews, right? I assume the J is for Jew.
I think, like, for example, getting Obama in the end of his second term to do these like really cosmetic measures, like condemn, some of the settlements in the West Bank and things like that, or, sanction these individual, Israelis that are doing these settlements, but not bringing any actual
I get you now.
substantive sanctions on Israel and things like that. But I do think that yes, for the most part, their interests do align. But I don't think that that's because, I mean, it's undeniable that especially if you read John Mearsheimer's book on it, that how much the Israel lobby has grown and its influence is unprecedented. But I also think that I do agree with people like John Steppling, who's not here, unfortunately, that it is to suggest that there's like, a cabal, or that it's, to overstate. Yes, there are, for example, what Carlo was talking about with these large Jewish donors to big universities. I do think we have to be careful to some degree, in the sense that it is more because of, as you were saying, policy interests, aligning with the United States. It's not like Netanyahu is actually dictating, U.S. policy. Yes, he has huge influence, but ultimately, Israel serves Western imperial interests, and I think that, it's a complicated discussion. I just think that it's not one or the other, that they use each other.
Yeah.
And that there are times when their interests don't align. As far as the specifics of that, that's why I cited the example of, Israel was ready to retaliate against Iraq. Everyone was so concerned when Iran, conducted this very measured response to the bombing of their embassy in Syria. In the start of the Gulf War, Saddam was bombing Tel Aviv with Scud missiles, and Israel was, ready to go, and the U.S. said no. And so that's like the most clear-cut example I would give about.
Just going to war with Iran, if Israel had its way, the United States would have been in a hot war with Iran 3 decades ago. So, but because the U.S. understands that's not in the U.S. interest, even though it's in Israel's interest, it doesn't happen. So, but my favorite way to conceptualize what is taking place is that the ruling class is, divided amongst innumerable different kinds of factions that have their own interests. So, a weapons manufacturer is going to have different interests from, a big tech company or an insurance company, health insurance company, who's going to have a different interest in the Ukrainian lobby, who's going to have a different interest in the Israeli lobby. And what happens is, there's a broad set of interests that they share in common, but then they also have competing interests, right? They compete for policy and for power within this establishment. And so, I think this competition happens behind the scenes, and there's a mechanism for getting a coalition, a consensus together that maximizes their their shared interests and pushes out those people that are wanting to advocate for things that don't benefit the ruling class, the ruling establishment. So Israel, I think, is best seen as a strong, powerful influence group within the ruling establishment, but they're not all powerful, and they can't get the U.S. to do things that are not obviously in the U.S. interest. So war with Iran is one of my favorite examples. But there's also, like you mentioned, Max, getting Israel to step down in order to maintain this coalition, in the Gulf War.
Well,
So
look at the way that they. Sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, look at the way I'm reading a book by James Bamford right now, and it's getting into the history of how Israel acquired its very clandestine, nuclear technology, and the whole Jonathan Pollard scandal, espionage scandal. Where they, this is something that they had to acquire through theft on U.S. Facilities, and of course, the United States isn't going to denies or tries to deny, as Israel does, that it has a nuclear program and so on and so forth, even though everybody knows that they do.
And they bring it up and then they retract it. But sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just the sheer fact that they had to, their interests butted heads, and Pollard was ultimately arrested and prosecuted, even though this guy who is actually a big Hollywood film producer, is a spy, Israeli spy turned Hollywood film producer, facilitated the whole thing. Didn't even get a slapper on the wrist. No, not Epstein. This other guy whose name escapes me. Yeah, I think that, and yes, there are factions within the ruling class that go at it behind the scenes. I mean, a perfect example is sort of, you can tell that there's a inner ruling class conflict in the, the sort of wings that, for example, Trump represents. I don't know if you could call it the entrepreneurial small business wing.
New money, upstart. Yeah, big money compared to us, but small compared to Silicon Valley, Wall Street.
Yeah. That you can see that playing the Robert Mercers of the world versus this other faction, what they call the globalist faction. But yeah, I think that you can see examples of this playing out in regard to Israel over individual issues. But I think that the problem with this whole discussion is that, and I would tend to be very critical of the traditional leftist view, not so much in what they have to say, but in their response, which is to, whenever people talk about the unprecedented influence of AIPAC, they have this knee-jerk, oh, you're flirting with anti-Semitism, or you're using tropes that are, it's like, it's not helpful to the discussion to do that. Obviously, if somebody is really doing that, it's fine to call them out. But I think that it's very often unfair. Like, I saw somebody doing it to Scott Ritter when Scott Ritter was talking about, about Israel's influence over U.S. policy, and someone was calling him an anti-Semite, and it was like, come on, this is just not really helpful to the discussion.
I resent those people, and they just assume the worst, and instead of listening to what you're saying, they assume an argument you're not even making, and then they further assume that you're making that argument that you're not making because you're an irrational hater of Jewish people. I hate it. It's disgusting. But yeah, I see a lot of it, especially on the fake left, not so much the correct left. Also, we're talking about Israel influence, Zionist influence. So I did a post recently, and I mentioned, there was a study. And the sourcing of that study is kind of dubious, but it was published in Haifa at a Haifa university, and it essentially said that 50% of Democratic campaign contributions originate from sources that identify as Jewish. It said 25% of Republican campaign contributions, originate from sources who identify as Jewish, and so I'm not sure if those are accurate numbers. That might be very, highly overinflated. But even if they're highly overinflated, because the sourcing is dubious, even though they were printed in the Jerusalem Post and they were published at a university in Haifa, even if they're overinflated, it still demonstrates, and it shows the outsized influence that just 2% of the electorate, can have on policy.
Well, you don't even have to mention it in terms of policy. You could just talk about it in terms of, if you even discuss those kind of statistics in terms of law or medicine, or especially if you mention things like entertainment, the entertainment business, like
Hollywood, yeah.
yeah, it's like as soon as you even mention that, it's like anti-Semite, when you're stating actual facts. I mean, they assume that you're drawing these other conclusions from that, because of what people on the very far right do, but that you can't even have the conversation. It's like you're not even allowed to discuss that, let alone about policy.
Yeah, let me add some data points. I've had some experience with this because here in Hungary, the liberal opposition, that's the Brussels opposition, they always said George Soros being the bad guy is an anti-Semitic dog whistle, until, actually read the massive influence he had in Eastern Europe in a very, very bad direction. So I know what all that is about, and you have to look behind it. I mean, there's a very simple Twitter handle called the APAC Tracker, I think. And they just the organization. Here's the number, very, very clean. And that's the organization. And it has just as damaging effect as, say, the US Chamber of Commerce. I don't see a difference. I don't see the Jewish aspect of this as helpful at all. Another data point, there's Thomas L. Friedman, the famous New York Times asshole, who did this op-ed opinion piece, which I think is amazing. And Israel has a choice to make, Rafah or Riyadh. Obviously, he's talking from the perspective of the current U.S. administration, that class of people. And it just go down in the article, and he already announces basically you can join an Arabian Arab alliance against Iran, or you can do the slaughter in Rafah, and then you're gone. But also going back a little bit to Dust James' point, there's one thing that I think all U.S. tiny or large, the ruling elite agree on is the petrodollar has to stay. So that is the make or break of the U.S. empire. Otherwise, everything gets unaffordable. And I wonder if the region's powers, like Saudi Arabia, who's been playing an interesting game, MBS has, know that Greater Israel, contains a large swath of Saudi Arabia, all of Jordan, a large swath of Egypt, these compradors. I wonder if they're aware of this, and is that compatible with their vision of the IMEC that I mentioned before, the Israel, Middle East, Europe gas corridor? Just a couple of points I wanted to add. Maybe it will just jolt some thoughts.
I have some thoughts. Max?
Well, I was just going to say, obviously, the normalization, those treacherous normalization deals between the Sunni Gulf states and Israel are really in limbo now in light of, this is, I think, if anything, become a real headache, an inconvenience for MBS and the Saudis, because they were, really enjoying that. And of course, they're not democracies, so it doesn't matter if their internal populations, whether it's Morocco or Saudi Arabia or UAE doing these normalization deals with Tel Aviv. This whole Gaza thing has really thrown a monkey wrench into that. But the Sunni monarchies, most of them, they've never really been supporters of the Palestinian cause, and they've been giving de facto endorsement, if anything, since going all the way back, to the Balfour Declaration. Saudi Arabia is a British creation, just like Israel was. And I think that more often than not, they've found themselves on the same side, not coincidentally, in various geopolitical developments in the region and theaters of conflict, especially, like, for example, in the Syria war, they were partnering with Israel pretty much to back the Syrian opposition. With Turkey, it gets a little bit more complicated, but I think more often than not, their interests actually align. As far as Israel's expansionist plans, that's why I was really cautioning people on the left who were so eager to jump on this pro-Kurdish, really exoticized bandwagon, because, if you look at the plans for Greater Israel, balkanizing Syria and creating a Kurdish enclave was very much in line with Israel's.
That was 10 years ago, and Russia stopped that, thank goodness, in its tracks. But
hard to believe it's been that long, but yeah.
Hillary Clinton's favorite revolutionaries, the
Yes.
Peshmerga women.
Yeah.
She was a big supporter of them. So I would agree with everything Max said. I mean, these are compliant puppet, monarchies put in place by the West, and they're not suicidal, so they're not going to go against their owner. And so, as long as the United States, the West, has this preponderance of geopolitical power around the globe, these monarchies, these despots, aren't going to go against the hand that feeds them and supports them, even though there's this natural pull from their people to stand up and to have the correct approach to Palestine. So you got this tug of war. But as the United States ceases to be all powerful, I think you're going to see what we see in Saudi Arabia, where the tug of war of the natural inclinations of the people and the government trying to at least appear to be a reasonable representative of the people's will is going to be less and less in the pro-U.S. camp, we hope. But that's all contingent again on Western imperialism declining in its power and declining in its ability to project power, project regime change in these countries, and to force these governments to follow the U.S. line. And we do see that giving way to some extent.
That's a pretty good segue into a discussion of China and Taiwan, I think, because I really think that's a powder keg waiting to blow as well. I mean, you've got U.S. troops now, I think even present on the Kinmen Islands, just a few miles off the coast of the mainland. And
can we hold that one?
Sorry.
Can we stick on Israel? Because Dust, I know we want to talk about your article a little bit more, and I wanted you to touch on maybe just the basic points that you brought up. Contextualizing why it went down how it did, why Stalin and the Soviet Union, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, kind of went against their own principles in order to vote for. They were the first country to recognize Israel as a state. So if that's not true, correct me. But go ahead.
The setting is 1948, 3 years past what they call the Great Patriotic War, right?
So Dust has not been thrilled with your analysis so far. You're just complaining about the mild annoyance of the people calling you an anti-Semite. But he wants to hear the substantive critique of Marxism, Leninism. So we want to give our viewers what they want. Next.
I don't think that's what Max is here to do, but you know what? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. He's contextualizing and he's explaining why it went down. But
I'm certainly not critiquing Marxism, Leninism. In fact, I'm doing the opposite in the article. If you read it, I'm talking about how for a very brief period the Soviet Union went astray from Stalin's own principles. If you read his work on the national question, he defined a nationality as a people with a common language, culture, and territory. So the final category of which did not apply to the Jewish diaspora in the Soviet Union, which was transnational. And yet they contradicted themselves for various reasons, which I get into, but they addressed the Jewish question, if you want to call it that. I know that's a very fraught way of addressing it, but the Jewish national question, they essentialized that as a nationality, even though I don't think it really applies, and that was their first mistake. They, to their credit, which I get into in the latter part of the article, they tried to counter Zionism with a progressive alternative. They set up the Jewish Autonomous Region, or otherwise known as Barobizan, and it was not successful for various reasons. Some people attribute that to the internal sabotage and political purges that went on, the tendency on the Trotskyist and social democratic left, predictably, is to try and single out Stalin as whatever. I think that that's a really big oversimplification. especially if you get into the history. As Ben was pointing out, it was 3 years after the Great Patriotic War. There was a sense of collective guilt and responsibility felt over the treatment of Jewish people by the Nazi regime, which of course had played a huge role in the war effort, which was of course, during the Nazi invasion, became the overwhelming priority, and understandably so. And they ended up losing over 25 million people. And rightly or wrongly, the Soviet opposition to Zionism was something that was put on hold. And actually, this was a very difficult article to write, because I had a tremendous difficulty getting a hold of the actual transcripts of, the Soviet ambassador to the UN at the time, and, the statements that were being made. And there was a very abrupt shift that occurred. And I think that's really a sign that there was a lot of internal division actually within the Politburo over this issue. On the surface, they never abandoned their official ideological opposition to Zionism. And even up to the very end, they stated that they preferred a one-state or single-state solution shared between the Jewish and Arab populations. And it was only after the UN had ruled that that was not possible. It was only after that it had ruled that a single-state solution was not possible that they then said, "Okay, we'll vote to divide Palestine." Obviously, that was a colossal, huge mistake that would come back to haunt them. I mean, not long after the Arab-Israeli War, Israel was sending, saboteurs into the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. And they very quickly reoriented toward the Arab League, although it's very, very unfortunate. I mean, even Ben Gurion himself said that we could not have won, at least in that particular instance, in that war. The Haganah would not have prevailed over the Arab coalition. But actually what's even worse is if you go back and looked at, this is just to give you an idea of how different a world it was in that short window of time. I believe the United States voted in favor of the right to return for Palestinians, and the Soviet Union voted against it. That's how different of a geopolitical order it was at the time, where the priority for the Soviets was to decline British imperialism and get a full withdrawal of the region from the British. And this was even though, the U.S. had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, clearly to send a message to the Soviet Union that they were the big nuclear superpower. But still at the time, the focus was on, the British and, who the Zionists at the time had been waging their so-called war of independence against, where they were bombing the King David Hotel and assassinating one of the British secretaries of state, I believe it was Lord Moyne, in Egypt, and killing British soldiers. And that shift where the Zionists actually started waging war against their former stewards or patrons, and the British, they started turning to Moscow, the Jewish agency in Palestine, and they were rebuffed by the Soviets at the time because they were aligned with the British during World War II. And after the Second World War ended, once it became clear, Churchill gave his speech, I think it was the Sinews of Peace, it's called, where he was, essentially signaling that the USSR was the West's new foe. Once their post-war relations began to sour between the British and the Soviets, the Zionists, really started to get Moscow's ear. And the other thing I get into in the article is really important context that can't go without being mentioned, is that the Zionists at the time, the labor Zionist faction, had prevailed internationally. And they were, of course, there's going to be people out there who are going to say, "Oh, the Soviets fell to Jewish trickery." That's not what I'm saying. They had
Didn't
a
sound
very
like that.
cosmetic left-wing pretense, and this was rampant throughout the Communist International. Of course, you get today a lot of Trotskyists and Social Democrats like to act as if they, even though I think Trotsky's son today, one of his sons lives in Israel and is like a rabid Zionist. You get a lot of these Trotskyist organizations trying to act like, oh, well, the Fourth International was always, anti-Zionist, and it was the Marxist-Leninists who became, rabidly pro-Israel. That's not true. And first of all, Trotsky was dead up to that point anyway, so you can't say what his position would have been otherwise had he been alive at the time. So, but no, the reasons were complicated. There's a huge role of Jewish labor organizations in the international communist movement. Within the Soviet Union, Jews had played a huge role in the war effort, and the support among the population to mobilize to fight against Operation Barbarossa. The reasons are a lot more complicated, but fundamentally the Zionists successfully portrayed themselves as socialists. That the state that they were trying to form was one that was collectivist and centered around the kibbutz and collective farming, and that they had, and of course you can understand why. I mean, given the track record of Zionism, which I get into, which was inherently anti-communist, this was seen as a positive change, and they were trying to nurture something that they thought was a positive development. Did they completely?
It's a marketing exercise, right? The kibbutzim being the socialist paradise of collective farming. It's always been a marketing exercise to show a nice glimmer on when everything below is pretty horrific. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the Soviets are absolutely guilty of, I think that they perceived not just the Palestinians, but the Arabs throughout the region as, backwards under monarchs. And here's this, now the labor Zionist faction leading the settlements. They were duped. It's unfortunate. And I also get into how I think that, the British had appointed the Mufti, who was himself very anti-communist, and that his flirtation with the Axis powers, his meeting with Hitler, which of course is something that I get into this, how Benjamin
It actually caused the Holocaust.
he made Hitler the
Hitler did it for
Holocaust, which of course is not true. But the important thing that was overlooked there in regards to this was that his avowed anti-communism, even though he was appointed by the British and he was not really a true representative of the Palestinians, that really tainted Arab-Soviet relations, especially in the wake of World War II, which, there was, as I said, a huge collective guilt felt towards the treatment of Jews by the Nazis.
Here's when I want to jump in a quick point, because I think everything you said is true on the highest levels, diplomatic, the Politburo and decisions. But this is why I tried to go to 1948, because the Soviet people were absolutely tired of war. The 27 million dead in defeating both Germany and Japan. They just wanted peace. Let's go back, let's rebuild, and that's it. And if you're taught by some Trotskyite asshole, you think it's an anti-democratic totalitarian state, Stalin's Soviet Union. No, it was far more democratic than everything in Western Europe, and these things need to be taken account. They didn't want a new war. 1 year later, by the way, NATO was created, the second poisonous gift from the US, and Stalin again didn't do anything. That was 1949, 1 year after the Nakba.
Well, the Warsaw Pact was created in response to NATO, but
true, a bit later, always responding. But I want to bring it back to the region, because there was another, I think, important New York Times article. It was about the Arab leaders, these sort of compradors, MBS including Qatar and
King of Jordan.
King of Jordan, especially because
Oh,
they're apparently
easy.
worried about all these protests and cracking down because soon they might feel it's turning on them. That's the other thing that Operation Truthful Promise, right? The Iranian strike on Israel achieved is the Ummah, the 1.8 billion Muslims from North Africa all the way through the Levant to the east to Central Asia, that they thought, it's that backward place of the, what do they call, the Ayatollahs with nukes, shit, they can do this. They're the heroes of the region on the Arab street. I'm not talking about the rulers. And a lot of these rulers are very, very uncomfortable with that. So much so that it gets into the New York Times, like featured big primetime articles. Also something to consider. So there's it can't just be dismissed whatever the fuck the people think.
There's a lot of Palestinians in Jordan, and King Hussein's got to be kind of careful. I don't know. I'm sure he's looking at that. I mean, his military is totally U.S. dominated and controlled, so they've got that going for him.
Without the token Palestinian wife born in Palestine, he'd already been ousted.
I would just say I think the Soviets, of course, they had a good reason to think that Israel would be an ally. I mean, after all, it was the Soviets that ended the Holocaust. It was the Soviets that liberated the death camps, and they just thought that goodwill would go a little bit farther than it did, and so did the West. The West thought, man, and that's why that might explain why the U.S. was voting against the right of return for the Palestinians, etc., or voting for the right of return for Palestinians, and the Soviets voted against it. But clearly,
I mean, the Arabs at the time were in the British camp. I mean, it's hard for people to understand that
fully
in retrospect, but at the time, it was a very different geopolitical alignment, and
Britain was the USA.
The facade that Israel was given was abandoned. I mean, pretty much as soon as Golda Meir went and visited the Soviet Union, they were already clashing. I mean, she was criticizing how heterogeneous their society was and how tolerant they were of all these different ethnic groups. And they were just like, what? So, yeah, I mean, it was very obvious. I mean, it was a huge blunder. But to, attribute it to, I mean, it was actually really difficult to write this article because the only most of the material that I could find on it was all written by, Trotsky, like Left Voice and all these places talking about, I think there was even an article called how Joseph Stalin helped create the state of Israel. And it's just like, just completely erases all the context. All these complicated historical processes that led to this decision. And I think that they just, I felt like it was a very important article to write because right now you have, socialism is no longer a dirty word in U.S. politics, and people are turning to socialism at the very same time. The Palestinian cause is reaching this South Africa-like moment, and they're going to look at this history and go, well, why on earth would the Soviet Union, if they're drifting towards more radical forms of socialism, that may have a favorable view of the Soviet Union, they're going to be puzzled by this chapter. So I thought it was a very important issue to address, and I wanted to know for myself, why did this? Because I honestly, when I started writing this article, I didn't fully understand why this real tragic mistake came about. I wanted to know for myself, and in looking into it, I discovered it was a lot more complicated than, of course, Trotskyists would like you to believe, which is to always try and use this as an example of how the revolution was betrayed by leadership after Lenin died. So
yeah, thank you, Max. I found it very informative, and so did Dust, by the way.
Thank you, Dust. I hope you read the article and enjoy this one just as much. Sorry.
Yeah, so the article was tremendous. I linked to it here in the comments, and you can find it at Covert. Is it Covert Action Mag?
Yeah, Covert Action Magazine. Okay. Yeah.
And then I want to say, I guess I was thinking Dust was earlier criticizing something, but I misunderstood Dust's comment. So he clarified that he was he was wanting a more of a Marxist-Leninist critique on the on the influence of the Israel lobby within the U.S. But
okay.
we kind of we dealt with that a lot. I'm thinking maybe move to China. I know last week I did have a disagreement. So there's a lot of people with this idea that China needs to do more, that China is not a responsible anti-imperialist country, that they're not serious about defeating imperialism, and that they're self-interested and they're more than happy to go along with imperialism. And so you mentioned Vanessa Beeley earlier, and she definitely kind of, in my interaction with her on Facebook, she kind of typifies this very wary of communism, of China, and they're very unhappy that China, sells drones to Saudi Arabia,
Israel,
sell drones to Israel, sell drones to Ukraine. So, this was, a position that we were discussing last week, and there's a lot of things to unpack, a lot of points to be made. One of the points that I don't see made very often is when we criticize China for doing business with Saudi Arabia or Ukraine or Israel, like it's a little bit hypocritical. Because if we're going to criticize China for doing business with anyone, it ought to be the U.S. The U.S. is 1,000 times worse than Saudi Arabia. They're 1,000 times worse than Ukraine or Israel. Like the United States is the worst of the worst. Like they're the leader of the worsts. And so if we're going to criticize China, how come nobody ever criticizes China for doing business with the United States? So there's a reason for that. There's a context to that. And I'm going to plug my most recent post on Facebook if you want to read about it.
Yeah, I would love to. Well, I think I've had this argument with people before, and I think it all proceeds from a fundamental misunderstanding of China. And it comes from a very short-sighted view of China, which is that, and you get this from people from various political views. And I think that it's because they pretty much don't understand China. It's very much in the same way, actually, that the Soviet Union conducted its foreign policy. The Chinese Revolution happened in the same way that the Russian Revolution happened, where specifically a wave of revolutions in Western Europe were supposed to happen alongside of it. This gets into the whole socialism in one country versus permanent revolution thing. Because capitalism or socialism is developing unevenly, the Chinese Revolution happened, and they have had to be self-interested, be in survival mode, and conduct their policies in a way that is, yes, from the outside looking in, is very contradictory. When it's actually the reasons that China has had to adapt to the global conditions of global capitalism and neoliberalism to survive. The reason that that's happened is because no one is leading a successful revolution in the countries that you and I are in. So they have had to, yes, the reason they have prioritized things like international trade over ideology and making these, conducting business with, the worst regimes in the world, including the United States with, we don't even have to get into a long list of illegal wars and everything that the U.S. has done. And China has even, not supported what are supposed to be Maoist revolutions on its doorstep, in Nepal and these other places. And instead have, done business with the very state entities that these revolutions are being waged against. China made all kinds of terrible foreign policy decisions after the Sino-Soviet split, for example, like supporting Augusto Pinochet. They supported the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. They supported UNITA in Angola. whatever else you want to name. I mean, they've made terrible decisions, but I think it's for it can be explained when you look at how China has really its priority has been playing the long game, and that's been to at the same time they've lifted nearly, I think they've reduced poverty from, they've doubled life expectancy. They've lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty.
Hundreds, yes.
Hundreds of millions, 700 million, I think. So I think it all proceeds from a very short-sighted view of China, and they don't understand why it's doing business with India and Israel and Saudi Arabia. And, its strategy has been to build alliances based on mutual cooperation and benefit, and they've done that with, yes, imperialist countries. And I think it's a very, very complex issue, but you always get this kind of perspective, not just from people like Vanessa Beeley. I don't know what her personal politics are. Something tells me she's probably more libertarian leaning, but even among the Western left especially is rabidly xenophobic.
It's completely mainstream. The Democratic Party says China's imperialism, they're snooping, they're spying, they're manipulating.
Yeah, this is one thing that the left and the
mainstream.
right unite totally. The left and right are totally in harmony about is the demonization of China. And I think it's there's a lot of people that really believe, even within China, Maoists who believe that the revolution was betrayed by Deng Xiaoping and as it embraced market-oriented reforms while the Soviet Union fell, and perestroika and glasnost, of course, were huge failures. Whereas the Tiananmen Square and Color Revolution of 1989, that was a failure, and China is now integrated with the West economically. But it's an important topic to discuss because right now, as I was mentioning earlier, Biden is really picking up where Obama left off with the pivot to Asia and containment policy, really saber rattling China right now. And I think that there's a real window of opportunity here. I don't know if China's going to take it, but it seems to me while the U.S. is really overextended, with the Israel-Gaza conflict and then the Ukraine quagmire, I could really see.
And the Red Sea, let's not forget. Operation Prosperity Guardian, completely useless, yes?
Yeah, I really think that China, it certainly seems like the U.S. is trying to goad them into it, might try and go into Taiwan because, I mean, Taiwan is so, it's gotten so rabidly nationalist. I mean, I was reading about how even within Taiwan, like they're starting to, this is similar to Ukraine, they're even tearing down statues of Chiang Kai-shek.
Yep.
Because they're really so intent on carving out this national identity to, what's of course a completely fake country, even more fake than Ukraine.
Even though the Chinese pretty much hate Chiang Kai-shek, but still.
Yeah. And Taiwan wouldn't, I mean, we don't need to get into the history, but it's so surreal seeing that. I mean, they're tearing down statues of.
Yeah, the KMT is a little bit too pro-reconciliation.
Yeah,
and
that's not enough.
They're visiting, the mainland. They're talking to Xi, and so they're done with that. You were mentioning some islands. You were going to talk about a specific a flashpoint that could ignite some kind of a conflict. I know in the South China Sea, of course, the U.S. is working with the Philippines over those disputed waters, trying to just meddle and just look for a justification, it seems, to to initiate and escalate conflict with China. It's kind of weird, right? It's like a dance. It's like the U.S. is the aggressive one. They're just pushing and pushing. But if they really wanted to push, they know what red lines to trip. And so it's just weird to see I think what the U.S. is doing, they're just building up. They're just going through these steps of escalation so it doesn't appear so grotesquely, obvious that it was totally the U.S. wanting war. And so the liberal historians, 10 years from now can write a history and hide that fact and obfuscate that fact. But, if the U.S. wants war with China, they know what the red lines are. They just tell whatever that lady is in Taiwan to declare independence, and that's it. Or they can, start shooting at, Chinese fishing boats in these disputed waters. That could, start but I don't know. It's tough to understand why they're doing this dance, because clearly they're aggressing and they're looking for escalation. But I think they want China to do something that they can really seize upon as a real justification, is what I'm thinking.
Obvious to everyone in the world, and just to add a little bit to this, that it's a warmongering in the South China Sea. Then they get Aquilino. I think he's the big that region, as in the admiral of the U.S. forces there, and he said China is pursuing this boiling frog strategy. How far can we take it? Whereas they're doing this salami tactic. How many weapons can we send Taiwan? What kind of weapons? They've sent long-range weapons and all that. And then he has the goal to say that. And the second data point is funny to me, because this is the guy who replaced Victoria Nuland after she was ousted as a State Department number 2, Kurt Campbell. Do you know who he recommended or nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize preemptively as this is going on? South Korea's Yoon, American Pie singing idiot, right? And Kishida. Both of them are having troubles at home with their electorate because they see them as sellouts. Both, and they're like preemptively nominating them for the Nobel Peace Prize. That was like the Alice Christoforou said would be the clown world of the week for me, or the weekend in this case.
Them and Obama, they haven't earned it.
Did anybody else here see that exchange between was it like some Arab business summit or diplomatic summit? Cheney and this Chinese diplomat.
Right.
And it's just absolutely incredible, because this Chinese diplomat, in very broken English, but still eloquently, just absolutely embarrasses him, talking about how the first communique officially between the People's Republic of China and the Nixon administration was, the United States swearing that it would abide the one China policy, and not, meddle in its affairs and recognize Taiwan, and how they have, that this was the very first exchange in communication officially diplomatically between the two countries, and Cheney had absolutely no answer to him. It was incredible.
Which Cheney?
Dick Cheney. Yeah.
Okay, not his daughter.
Yeah, his corpse is, there's still a little bit of life left in him, no matter how many packs of cigarettes he smoked back in the 70s. He's still breathing. But yeah, it's a very funny exchange.
It's a recent one too?
Yeah, it just had.
That's interesting. I thought Dick was pretty much out of public life, but that's interesting. He's still attending these things.
I thought so too. And yeah, he was, he was sitting there, slumped like Kissinger and opposite this Chinese diplomat. And yeah, he gets made a fool of.
But that's a huge aspect of it, is the hypocrisy of the United States, exhibits when they're a signatory to all these agreements. They know Taiwan is part of China. They agree that Taiwan is part of China. And then they're still pushing this, we're going to treat Taiwan as not part of China. It's like,
look at what did Xi Jinping say to Mr. Blinken, who was then tossed out like a used, basically toilet paper, go to your airport and fuck off. Basically, your words don't match your deeds. Yeah, that's what he said straight up.
Yeah, and that's why they want to come over at arm's length, and they don't want anything to do with them, because they know you guys are just up to no good. We can't believe anything you say. You say one thing, you do another, and that's been going on for years now. And they're getting tired of it, and that's why I think we're getting closer and closer to a conflict, at least to an escalation. How that escalation is managed, what it looks like, is we'll find out what the West's plans are, but it's the West driving this due to their panic that if they don't do something, they're going to lose. They're going to lose their hegemony. They're going to lose their power to influence, governments around the globe, and the dollar, of course, is going to lose its power. So these are the things that they're seeing, and they're trying to figure out a way to avoid happening, but it's inevitable. They can't stop it.
I can't believe that the Ukraine debacle, which is shaping up to be an enormous humiliation, is not enough for them. And this is probably 10 times that. If they actually do something, it's going to be far worse than anything in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking. And why would Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Japan go along with it? I mean, even their leadership has got to see. They've got to see the scenes in Ukraine. My God, do you really want that for Taiwan?
You'd hope, right?
Or South Korea, or the Philippines? I mean, it's
Well, they're occupied countries, Carlo. They don't have sovereignty. Japan can't decide its own policy. There's a whole bunch of Marines on that island. Same with South Korea. So they've been occupied vassals since the end of World War II. But you're right. I mean, it's a problem for the governments because they're being seen as feckless puppets who are sacrificing their own society to benefit U.S. interests.
And there's huge protests within both of those, especially South Korea and Japan, about U.S. military presence and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and the Philippines, as I pointed out before, Aguinaldo and Frederick Funston, and then you had Lansdale and Magsaysay, and they have a almost 123-year history of being a vassal to the United States, with few exceptional years.
Mark Twain did some great depictions and descriptions of U.S. Atrocities against the Filipinos that wanted independence. Once they got independence from Spain, they became a U.S. U.S. occupied territory, basically, and the Filipinos resisted, but they lost.
Twain recorded Rudyard Kipling, right? With that, isn't that what he wrote? What was it? I think it was which poem it was escapes me, but yeah, he retorted Rudyard Kipling, White Man's Burden.
Yeah, and Twain wrote the War Prayer, so it's really powerful.
I know he depicted this atrocity where there was just an entire village of women and children that they just put machine guns around the top and just murdered them all. So you can read that. It's from Mark Twain. It's like I forget, were they the Moros or something? Was the people that anyway? Google Mark Twain and Filipino independence, and you'll get all kinds of atrocities committed by the U.S. So it's not looking good for Western imperialism, but the big question is what are they gonna do? So the China is telling them confrontation is lose for the humanity, cooperation is the future. What are you going to choose? And it just seems clear that the West is going to choose confrontation. And what that looks like is the $1 million question. But
Wang Yi said the phrase either cooperation and harmony or a downward spiral. Downward spiral was the key phrase here, and that's what it looks like. The West's hell-bent on
death, destruction, economic catastrophe. But guess who doesn't get affected by that? Guess who isn't going to die? Guess who isn't going to have their billions and billions?
The Jews.
Affected to a degree.
You had to.
Sorry, I could not resist.
Good one.
So thank you, Max, for getting us kicked off of Facebook and everything. No, not them. No, the capitalist, global capitalist class, the wealthy elites, the industrialists.
Same thing, Billy Bob. Same thing.
Touché.
Slightly less euphemisms, please.
So is France like the canary in the coal mine for losing its empire? I mean, it's rapidly
France?
being. Yeah, I mean, is You have a much more
geez.
powerful entity in the United States. But what's happening to France is that like a precursor? I mean, or something? I mean,
So I mean, you mean okay? So
You're talking about the coups in Africa, like Burkina Faso?
Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, now Senegal and Chad. That's 5 countries that in the Sahel. That's,
by the way, it took some work to find.
For the French.
It took to work some find it, but just over the weekend, at least 5 African states has begun repatriating their gold, looking at the U.S.'s economic problems.
Yes.
They bring it back to us. Thank you. Oh, unnoticed, under the radar, but I think it could be significant.
Yeah, Cameroon and I can't remember.
Yeah, Nigeria as well, which is like the
Carlo
biggest
was
American.
referencing the troops going to Ukraine, and I thought that was the precursor he was referencing. But but it could be either one, because that France being the first one to send their troops to Ukraine could be a precursor. But also all these countries jumping ship, getting out of the imperial, out from the being exploited imperial proxies to having sovereignty and really allying with the anti-imperialist bloc is also hopefully a precursor of things to come in greater numbers from more countries around the planet. Hopefully South Korea, hopefully Japan, hopefully the Philippines, when they see what the alternative is. And I'm sure the United States would be happy to sacrifice all those countries to the last person, just like they're sacrificing Ukraine to the last Ukrainian.
I mean, when it comes to Europe, I mean, we didn't talk about it a lot this time, but I can tell you it's uncontrolled, impotent rage is what's come over Macron, all the Western leaders, including, well, the British and the French, and sort of the Germans are playing like a middle game, but what's come over them, because they have seen this, and this, we don't really need sound, but it's, annotated by a Russian gentleman.
Еще одна точка притяжения ко Дню Победы 9 мая появилась в Москве, ну как новая, это старая, это вход к Музею Победы, а прямо перед ним расположилась экспозиция трофейной техники со всего мира. Она доставлена сюда, поверженная, уничтоженная нашими российскими бойцами в зоне специальной военной операции. Огромное внимание зрителей, огромное внимание публики, людей, которые пришли в музей, которые гуляют по солнечной Москве через ограждение, пытаются...
There it is. Let's stop it there, because that is the most advanced, I think, the 6th version of the German very, very Wunderwaffe super tank, the Leopard 2A6. Right, the most advanced version there, and they really, really don't like this. And just before this show, I saw the latest German, lethal aid package that they publicized, and it's got 10 Marder infantry fighting vehicles, their version of the Abrams, basically. It's got one of these pew-pew air systems. It's called, oh, Jesus Christ, I forgot, like Striker or something like that. It's like the promo videos about drones sitting completely still in the sky, and then it pews down. It does nothing against ballistic missiles, let alone. And they're sending some ammunition for their Iris-T air defense system, which they sent 2 of, and 1 at least was confirmed destroyed. It's nothing. They're out of everything. They got less than 100 workable tanks. The British are even worse. They know they're in a goddamn quagmire. And in Russia, I mean, if, for instance, Ian watches this, I wish I was him, because this week is going to be fantastic. I mean, it's going to be May 5, which is Orthodox Easter. Big stuff. May 7, it's going to be the inauguration of Vladimir Putin. And May 9 is Victory Day, right? That's Победа. I don't know why they call that park at the top of this hill. They call it Победа Park, but the translation seems to be... instead of victory, it seems to be Patriot Park. But this hill, and I found it fantastic. The literal translation of Pokloyana Gora is the bow down hill. This is how the Russians bow down, because this is apparently the place where Napoleon sat with his troops and waited for someone to bring the keys of the Kremlin. And instead, his forces got minced, and he got basically, fought all the way back to Paris.
Did you see the Hollywood film by chance?
Which one?
The Ridley Scott Napoleon.
I watched half of it and I said no. It was
the Hollywood movie, so I mean it was not very good. But the one part of it that was incredible was the scene where Napoleon tries to invade Russia, and the scorched earth tactics, and they all get frozen. That part I was like, whoa. But
It's the mythos, by the way, that the cold defeated them. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
not true. But I do like Joaquin Phoenix. But I do not like Joaquin Phoenix's Napoleon. He was a considerable commander, and in this, he looked the wimpy and stupid to me. You know?
yeah,
More interested
pretty
in
much.
skirts than in warfare. That's I didn't like the film.
Abel Gance. I've seen Abel Gance's monumental epic on. Actually, I've carried it. Are you guys familiar with that? I think it was done in the 1920s. Silent film. It weighed. We got it in 8 16mm reels, which weighed about 50 pounds each. So and my wife has a Bell and Howell. We have it. We used to have a Bell and Howell camera, and we could watch all these films. And a local library, this guy, Mr. Moore, had a secret cache of these rare films, which he would misrepresent in the catalog published by the library. But my wife, who knows film thoroughly, she cracked the code, and she said, "This sounds like an Abel Gance film, or this sounds like a Buñuel film, or this sounds like an Eisenstein film." And so for several years, we plundered this guy's library of 16mm films and watched hundreds of films, scaring the bejesus out of them because nobody else knew enough to take them out. And the Abel Gance, it runs about all 8 reels. It ran about 6 hours. So
Wow,
it's quite
a
an
6-hour,
undertaking.
6-hour long silent movie.
Yeah, and the retreat back to you can stay awake for it. The retreat back to Paris with the Russian forces on his heels is quite spectacular.
I did see Sergei Bondarchuk, who did War and Peace, of course. Speaking of long films, I did see his film on Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo. I think it was Rod Steiger playing Napoleon. That was pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the Hollywood Ridley Scott film was, it was pretty disappointing.
I have a hard time watching Hollywood movies that depict actual events. Like I'm just put off by it because I always know I'm going to be so frustrated in how it's portrayed.
And
yeah, go ahead.
I just want to do a brief advertisement
Okay.
for Covert Action Magazine, formerly Covert Action Information Bulletin, founded by Lou Wolf and I believe Philip Agee. And it's been around for a long time. Max, your article was tremendous. I'm never too young to learn, and
Thank you.
learned a great deal from it. And I want to say that Lou Wolf was a customer of ours when I had a store on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., a bookstore. And he would come by. And one day I remember very clearly, he came by and he said he'd just been contacted by Ted Koppel's Nightline. And they wanted to know about what topic they could suggest that from Lou Wolf of Covert Action Information Bulletin at the time, that they could do a show about. And the only ones they were interested in were ones that were at least 5 years old, so they wouldn't have a huge impact on the political scene today. And the other thing is that when Philip Agee came back into the country, C-SPAN was supposed to record him, and they backed out at the last minute. So they called us. Maybe I might have been Lou Wolf, but they called my wife and I because we had a community. What do you want to call it? A community TV show
Access,
that we did once a week with alternative news. And we went down and we taped Philip Agee, she on the left side of the auditorium and me on the right side, and we gave the raw tape to them. So if you ever see any footage of Philip Agee when he's coming back into the U.S., that's Rosalie and I. That we did it.
Are you talking about I've seen Inside the CIA on Company Business? Are you talking about like those interviews with him?
No, not the interviews. Just a lecture he gave when he came back. The first appearance he made, public appearance back in the country, and C-SPAN for unknown reasons backed out at the last minute. So we got the gig. We with our. I've showed these guys the old camera I used to use. So,
It's a monster.
I just wanted to point that out. Well,
that should be at the top of the comments, Dust. I think.
Yeah, I put a link to article at the top of the
Yeah.
comments, but I'll put it in the YouTube description as well once I'm done here.
Tremendous article.
Yeah,
Good
so
plug, good
everybody,
plug.
I've shared the article
Carlo.
with.
I'm sorry, what's that?
I said thank you for that anecdote.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm, just trying to promote myself.
It's Chris Phil's son is the chief editor there now, along with Jeremy Kuzmarov. So I've met Chris Agee.
Yeah. His dad's still alive, as far as I know.
I think he might have actually passed. I think.
Oh, did he pass?
Yeah.
I looked him up several months ago, and they had him relegated to going through photographs. He was a great guy, good person.
So Philip Agee was a former CIA operative that really switched sides, and he lived in Cuba for a long time. And then so when he came back, ostensibly he was coming back from Cuba. But yeah, I don't know how he ended up. I read his book. I have his book, just exposing, how the CIA works and all that kind of stuff. And it was the Church Commission was around that time too, right? Or
Church.
So that was
Rockefeller Commission.
Yeah.
But ever since then, the CIA has totally changed. So it's not that.
It doesn't do that anymore.
Yeah. So don't worry about that, YouTube.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a good plug for Covert Action. Before it was magazine, what was it?
Covert Action Information Bulletin. Yeah.
And I was going to say, Max's article, everybody who I've shared it with has thanked me. So I take credit for sharing it, but actually Max should get some credit too, because he did write it. But no, everybody has said, hey, really valuable, interesting, and educational. So well written, I might add. But
yeah, I only wish it was easier to get. I would have done a lot more. I mean, it was a very hard thing to write. It was not easy to get, like, for example, even a hold of like the transcripts of Gromyko, or whatever his name was, the Soviet ambassador to Israel. It was not hard to get. It was very hard to get the information, and to go back through old Communist Party USA newspapers to try and understand. Because, like I said, the only people who had really written about this were people who were looking to smear the Soviets. And I even found more information in like, big beltway, like foreign policy think tanks writing about why they thought the Soviets had, for whatever reason, supported Israel. There was very little work done by actual left-wing or socialist writers or whatever about the issue. So I felt like it was important to address.
I've got your next project in mind. Try to get to the truth behind the Katyn Forest massacre. I mean, you need years in the archives.
Well, Grover Fur,
Grover Fur did it. Yes, I know. Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, of course, like the Soviet archives tell a different story, but yeah, I would like to address that, because it is an important, it is one of those things that's used to demonize the Red Army, and it is an important, just like the Holodomor and all that.
Relevant to modern Russia, which is undergoing changes, but definitely a topic for another time. So I think I'd like to thank you very much for this very informative appearance. So do I think the regulars in the chat.
Thank you. I mean, I consider myself a much better writer than a public speaker. I mean, anytime I get invited to do these things, I get imposter syndrome, because I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker. But thank you for inviting me. It was great.
We think you did a fantastic job just speaking.
So, a lot of detail.
And I get better and more comfortable the more I do it, and then I just stop caring too. So the more you do it, it's just practice.
Yeah.
So, I want to thank everyone. We will be back on Friday for episode 76. Lots going on. It's as Sean Fu says, it's crazy times. That's his sign off.
As we navigate through these crazy times. Yes.
Okay, we will see you then. Bye. Thank you very much.